Well, it's great to be with you all today, and I would just now like to invite you to join with me in a moment of prayer as we prepare to receive the sermon. Let us pray together. Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, for you are our strength and our salvation. Amen. Well, some years ago, I figured out that the three most problematic words in the church are these: all are welcome. All are welcome. How many times have you seen these three words emblazoned on a church sign or posted on a church website or at the top of a church bulletin? And how often have you secretly thought in your mind, really? Am I really welcome here? Do they mean me? Does this church really welcome everyone? Or are some people not included in that welcome? All too often, it has been the case that churches don't really mean all when they say all are welcome. I can tell you a story from my own life many years ago about a church that I served in New York City in the early 1990s. I was just part-time, kind of an assistant pastor while I was in my doctoral studies. And I was serving this church, this Presbyterian church in downtown New York. And this was the very first church in which I had the guts, I guess you could say, to start coming out to them as a lesbian pastor. So to really share my full identity as a pastor, because it was actually illegal at that point to be a gay or lesbian pastor in the Presbyterian church. So you had to be really thoughtful and intentional about who and when you shared that information. And the great thing about this church was that they were pretty welcoming of LGBT people, and yet there was a little bit of hesitation. There was a little reticence to really come out and say it. So they were one of these churches that had a statement about all are welcome, but it was very generic. It didn't like really come out and say that what that meant was that LGBT people, for example, were welcome. And so when I started working there as a part-time assistant pastor, I had some pretty pointed debates with the senior pastor there at the time about this. And there was a movement in the Presbyterian church back then that's like our open and affirming movement. At the time, it was called the More Light movement. So if you were a More Light church, that meant you had seen the light and had decided to be very explicit about welcoming LGBT people into the church, the life of the church, which actually put you at odds with or in violation of the denomination's policy. So it was a pretty big deal. And so he felt that the church did not need to become a More Light church. He felt that they didn't need to spell it out. They didn't need to say the words that the church was welcoming to LGBT people. And what I tried to explain to him was that when you have a default setting in a church, which the Presbyterian church certainly did, that gay folk and queer folk were not welcome, then it wasn't enough to just say all are welcome, because there was an asterisk. And the people that were covered by that asterisk knew very well who they were, that there was an exception. to the welcome. And so the only way to get past that, to be truly welcoming, was to name the people that historically or even in the current moment were generally excluded from full membership, from all the full rights and privileges of being part of that church. So we had these debates. But the interesting thing about that church was, even though it wasn't there, it was at that point, it was not a Morelite church. It didn't state that explicitly in the welcome. And yet, every year, the New York City Gay Pride Parade went down Fifth Avenue and went down right by that church's entrance. And at some point, they decided that they were going to go out and offer cold water, cups of cold water, to the marchers. And it became this wonderful thing. And Presbyterians from all over the city would congregate in front of First Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue on Gay Pride Sunday. And we would organize the water brigades, and we would take cold water out to the marchers, and they appreciated it so much. And so the funny thing is it did become known as an LGBT welcoming church. And it eventually found its way towards that explicit welcome and really coming out and having the courage of their convictions that I had been hoping for. And so I was proud of them. But you know, it goes to show that we are all imperfect. We are all beautifully imperfect in how we get to where we need to go. We don't always get there all at once. Sometimes it takes time. Well, all too often, whether it's about LGBT folks, whether it's about people with a different skin color, whether it's about education level or political ideology, all too often there's a lot of unspoken words that get crammed in between the all and the are welcome in that phrase, all are welcome. Unfortunately, in most churches, there's some nonverbal messages and cues that really come out like, all who look like us and talk like us and believe like us and worship like us, all of you all are welcome. And you know, the thing is you don't usually have to come out and tell people that they're not welcome. It's usually quite sufficient just to give people a cold shoulder or the stink eye, or, you know, just kind of, you know, just not be very openly, warmly welcoming for people to get the message. Well, that's something that churches, I think, have been struggling with for a long, long time. And we're all over the map, you know, churches are, about how much we really wish that we could be fully welcome and how much we're just pretty comfortable and complacent as we are. But even if we're all the way over on the side of wanting to be fully and inclusively welcoming, there are things that get in the way. One of those things you've probably heard of by now is called implicit bias. Implicit bias. It's those unconscious things in our deep in our brain, our limbic brain, our reptile brain, that make us more comfortable around some people than others, around people that we recognize as being our tribe or like us. And those things are very difficult to dismantle, even when one wants to do so. But I will say something for First Congregational United Church of Christ. And that is that you know that it's not enough to just say the words, all are welcome. You know that when whole categories of people have often been excluded from our churches, that we have to say a little bit more. You took one step in that direction back in, I believe it was 1992, somebody can correct me, but when you became open and affirming. and you adopted your open and affirming resolution, your identity, which says, and I'm quoting now from your website, the church website, it's a designation which signifies our commitment to welcome and honor the participation, wisdom, and leadership of people of all sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions in our spiritual community. That was a big deal. I think you were still one of the first churches in this conference to make that commitment to be open and affirming. And you have been living into it and really living it out. Doesn't mean that there's not still some room to grow. Queer folk, we're always pushing the envelope, right? And there are always ways in which new things are coming up about gender identity and gender fluidity and family configurations and things that are challenging in a sort of heteronormative society. And the church struggles with those things. But you are on record. You are on record, and you are striving to live into a radical welcome in this regard. More recently, this church has taken another step, and you have designated yourselves as an immigrant welcoming congregation. And that is so important. That is one of the most important things in this contemporary moment in our national history. One of the most important things you can do, because we certainly can no longer assume that immigrants of any immigration status or any citizenship status are welcome anywhere, sadly, in this country. We can't assume that. And we certainly can't assume that they are safe and that they are protected. And so this congregation, just a little over a year ago, decided to make that welcome explicit. And so you passed an immigrant welcoming declaration, which begins, "We are followers of Jesus, who welcomes everyone and treats everyone with dignity and compassion." As members and friends of First Congregational UCC, Portland, Oregon, we are called by our God to work to create a world where there are no longer strangers, responding in word and action whenever lives are made vulnerable or injustice occurs. In these days, we are moved by our faith and consciences to stand together with our immigrant brothers and sisters and their families. So important. Our church has even been looking into how to be prepared, should the moment arise, to offer emergency sanctuary to an immigrant or a couple of immigrants who need temporary shelter to be protected from deportation. We're looking into modifying part of the building to provide such a temporary shelter should such a need arise. And so there are some really cutting edge ways in which this church is striving to offer welcome. When you revisited your bylaws in 2015, you may remember that the congregation made being a welcoming church, another word for that, of course, is hospitality. You made that one of the 3 pillars of your church life. You organized the church into the core ministries of community, peacemaking, and hospitality. It's built right into your church covenant. And the first commitment of the church covenant says that you will create a sacred space that is accessible and welcoming to everyone. Well, our passage from Matthew today shows how important offering an authentic welcome was to Jesus. I want to repeat Jesus's words here, and I'm going to come back to them a little bit later to unpack them. But Jesus says in the passage we heard, whoever, now he's speaking to his disciples who he is sending out. He is sending them out in ministry to heal, to tackle the forces of evil and liberate people from bondage to evil systems and structures, and to feed and teach, and really to be Jesus's extended presence in the community. He's sending them out and he says, whoever welcomes you welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And then he says this strange thing, whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Jesus's words here remind us how central this thing about welcoming others, radical hospitality, was to Jesus. In the UCC, we like to say that we are a people of extravagant hospitality. And Jesus had an extraordinary ability to make people feel welcome, in fact, to be welcome, just as they were, with no asterisks, no conditions attached, no unspoken exceptions made. Jesus welcomed, ate with, healed, consorted with, and enjoyed physical affection from people that scandalized the good folk of his time. People who were ritually impure, who would literally make Jesus unclean in the standards of his day when they touched him or he touched them. And as UCC minister Catherine Matthews says, it seems that Jesus's place of welcome was able to travel with him wherever he went, as he was able to make people feel at home wherever and however they met him. And then she challenges us with this question: how did the church move so far away from living in a place of welcome to be perceived by many as sitting in judgment instead? She asks, why don't people feel more at home when they come to church? I think that Reverend Matthews raises an important question for us to think about. Why don't more people feel at home when they come to church? And I wonder how you would answer that question. It might be something we could discuss following the service during coffee hour. Now, this church has tried in various ways to make people feel welcome when they come to church. We have smiling greeters at the door and friendly ushers. We provide name tags that people can make out right then and there and keep to use every Sunday. We've created a welcoming children's corner in the back of the church with a rocking chair and children's books, and made the old minister's office into an incredibly warm and cozy library that stays open during the service if anyone needs a quiet space just off the sanctuary. Before COVID-19 hit, we were able to enjoy all of these things in our sanctuary space, and we shared handshakes and hugs during worship. We did our best to welcome new faces, and our warm welcome has worked. It's drawn all of you, for example, at one time or another into our fellowship. And of course, there are other things as well, like our Outreach Gallery downstairs, which draws people through our doors during the week and sometimes brings them back out of curiosity to try out a Sunday service. But we know that there are barriers. For one thing, now that we are stuck in our homes during COVID-19, we can't even enjoy our beautiful building. Thank God we've just been able to reopen the gallery again. So run down there on Tuesday. It doesn't open on Monday, but run down there on Tuesday and see the beautiful art that's been up for months now that nobody's been able to enjoy. But we can't be together in our space, and that is so challenging for us. But even when we are together in our space, there are some barriers. We don't necessarily have the most accessible church in terms of having a sanctuary on the second floor and the nursery, for example, 2 flights down in the basement. Our architecture is grand and beautiful, but it doesn't always feel the most relational in our large sanctuary with the forward-facing pews. And if someone were to drop in on a Sunday, they'd find a lot of beautiful white faces, but not a whole lot of darker skin tones to welcome them. And so this is not in any way to pass judgment, but simply to raise our consciousness, to ask the question, what kind of cues get communicated unintentionally when someone sets foot in our building, when someone comes into one of our services, whether it's a virtual service or a physical present service? Now, I know that this congregation strives to be a place of extravagant hospitality in values, in practices, and in beliefs. But we have a golden opportunity right now to ask what gets in our way, what unspoken or nonverbal or architectural or implicit bias or other kinds of barriers get in our way. Because this is a moment when we are being shaken out of ruts that we have been in, habit energies that give us a chance in this moment of shaking, in this moment of being shaken loose from habit energies, to reflect, to ask hard questions and think about new possibilities of being welcoming in the way of Jesus. So I would say that right now there's 2 golden opportunities handed to us by forces beyond our control. One of those, of course, is COVID-19. It has literally shut us out of our sanctuary, but we're being forced to come together to find one another in some radically new ways. We've literally had to reconstitute ourselves, haven't we, as a body? We've had to do that in virtual spaces. We've had to do that by making phone calls, reaching out to one another, by sending cards, by council members and called to care team members, literally like picking up the phone and calling everyone, by emailing, by holding one another in prayer in even more intentional ways. We've had to reweave the tissue of our church body without the aid of the crutch, you might almost say, of a physical place to be and to call home. And it might be time to say, how are we doing? How are we doing now with extending our welcome? Are we being creative in extending our welcome? Or are we already becoming complacent in our virtual spaces? Are we sufficiently mining the opportunity to help new people find us who might actually be able to join us in our new virtual spaces, who wouldn't have been able to come to downtown Portland? Now, Andre's a great example of this. Andre has his mom attending church from South Africa. So come on, folks. Who do you know in another part of this country, in another part of this city, in your friendship network that might love this community, that might get something meaningful out of it? Maybe not church on Sunday, but maybe it would be church on Sunday. Maybe it would be our Thursday night discussion group or our Friday meditation group. Who knows? But think about it. Think about who you might invite to find us, to welcome in to our space. I wonder too, are we following up? And I'm asking myself this question too. Are we following up when we see new names and faces in our Facebook feed or our Zoom rooms? Are we reaching out and really welcoming new people in and extending our friendship network with them? And once we can regather physically, will we continue to make this kind of space available for those who, for various reasons, can't make it to 1126 Southwest Park Avenue? Something to think about. The second golden opportunity that's thrust itself upon us is this renewed Black Lives Matter movement. The movement spawned by the moment that traumatized our nation, George Floyd's death. Like the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, building on so many other senseless and criminal deaths of Black folks at the hands of police, it's forcing a time of reckoning upon us all. We're being asked to examine the foundations of white supremacy that are at the roots of our entire national project and even of our denominational histories. Our denomination has some things to be proud of, like supporting the legal defense of enslaved Africans who mutinied on the Amistad slave ship and eventually won their freedom. But bright spots like that don't exonerate us from all the ways we've benefited from white privilege in amassing wealth, property, status, endowments. Think about the fact that when this congregation was founded and bought the land on which to build its building, Blacks were not even allowed to live or stay overnight in the state of Oregon. It's shocking. I wonder if a conversation will emerge among churches in the US about what reparations could look like for us. Well, sometimes you have to just start somewhere. One place we are starting is the Portland Protest Respite Station. I am so grateful to those of you who have been volunteering at this station, for those of you on council who approved setting up this station, for Carter, our Peacemaking Core Ministry facilitator, who's been there every night it's been open so far. This station is essentially functioning as an aid and respite station where street medics can come and, as we just heard before the service last night, administer first aid to people hit by tear gas or rubber bullets, or people who just need a drink of water, or a safe place to breathe, or a place to use the restroom, or simply a place to feel welcome by a faith community as they maybe put their lives on the line for racial justice and for reforming and dismantling white supremacy, not just in our law enforcement, but in the rest of our society as well. So we've started, and yet there's a long way to go. Jesus said, "Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, none of these will lose their reward." This thing about in the name of, whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet, whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person, what does that mean? It was actually a saying in that time, a Semitic saying that meant you welcome that person as they are. If they're a prophet, you need to give them a certain kind of welcome. If they're righteous, you give them a different kind of welcome. And if they are a disciple, what Jesus called a little one, you give them a disciple's welcome. How does that translate to today? I think it means we need to see people truly as they are and give them an appropriate, authentic welcome that meets them where they are, that accepts them in all their fullness, in all their integrity, and that makes room for them at our table, at Christ's table. Maybe even if we have to change and get a little uncomfortable to do so. No one reminds us more eloquently than the writer Barbara Brown Taylor that we're not called to be consumers of God's love, but providers. Church is not a hideout. It's not the place where those who know the secret password can gather to celebrate our good fortune, but it's the place where people come together and go forth to offer healing, radical mercy, restoration, and even resurrection. Friends, let us go forth, because we are not the people who are meant to stay in a building. We are the people that are meant to go out and take the good news, to bear Christ and Christ's love to all we meet. Amen.